Turn up the dive, feel the vibe, get ready to ignite. Untold stories in the airways, flying through the night. Experience voices, tales so bold. Streaming live, the truth unfolds. Untold Radio Network, where secrets come alive. New episodes daily, the mysteries thrive. Great guests, super chat, it's so I remember right. Share and subscribe, join the side where truth can't hide. Aliens in the attic, UFOs in the sky. Cryptids lurking, oh my, oh my. Ghosts in the hallway, whispering your name. The paranormal, the unexplained. Become a VIP, get the inside scoop. Unlock the mysteries, be part of the group. Live streaming stories, they're talking to you. Super chats buzzing, join the crew. Untold Radio Network, the secrets come alive. New episodes daily, the mysteries thrive. Great guests, super chat, it's a wild member ride. Share and subscribe on the side where truth can hide. So if you've got the guts and you want to explore, tune into the untold, it's what you're looking for. From aliens to ghosts and all that's unseen. Untold Radio Network, where the world's mysteries convene.
The paranormal, UFOs, monsters, mysteries. You're listening to Talking Weird. And now, from a cabin deep in the Northwoods, your host, Dr. Dean Bertram.
Greetings, all my fellow weirdos and weirdettes. Welcome to Talking Weird on the Untold Radio Network. I'm your host, Dean Bertram, and as always, I'm delighted you're joining me, whether on one of the video platforms the show goes out on, YouTube, X, or what's the other, Facebook, of course, or whether you're listening to us later on one of the many podcast platforms where the audio-only version plays. As you can probably tell, I still have a little bit of a cold. This thing's been hanging on to me for weeks now, and I'm normally very healthy, so I'm very grateful that I have an incredible guest who'll be able to do most of the talking tonight so I can mute myself and cough when the need arises. Tonight's guest is, I think, one of the most important intellectual thinkers within the entire space of the weird. He's an incredible academic. He's an author, a librarian, a curator, and a researcher. He specializes in science fiction, religion, theology, bibliography, book history, and parahistoriography. His past work includes books on theology and science fiction, and he also wrote an amazing piece on Richard Shaver, actually, which is how I first got to meet him. Curating exhibitions on Edgar Allan Poe and Mark Twain as well. And he also worked as part of the editorial team for Philip K. Dick's EXEGESIS, and I didn't know he did that work on that book, so I might have to ask him a little bit about that tonight, because the exegesis is amazing and is so important and so worth reading to anybody who has an interest in the writings of Philip K. Dick, as I clearly do. His most recent book, though, is just incredible. I've started to read it. It's amazing. I was lucky enough to get an advanced copy, but it's available later this month, and it's called The Saucerian: UFOs, Men in Black, and the Unbelievable Life of Gray Barker. So I am delighted to welcome to Talking Weird, Gabriel Mckee.
Hi, great to see you. Good to talk.
Man, it's so great to be able to chat to you again. I always love talking to you.
Yeah, and you too. Yeah.
You're a powerhouse of knowledge in this space. As I just mentioned then in the intro, because it wasn't mentioned in your biography I'd put together, your article on Shaver is fantastic, and that's available online, by the way.
It is, yeah. It was in the Journal of Gods and Monsters, so a peer-reviewed journal on monsters and religion and theology. So kind of the overlap between monster theory with religion.
And what's the
And
title of
actually,
that again?
the title of the paper was "Reality, Is It a Horror?" Richard Shaver and the Displaced Self, I think was my subtitle.
People should go and read that, because they can just Google that and Google your name and they'll find it and be able to download it.
Yeah, and actually, as we speak, I'm preparing a paper that I'm going to be presenting at a conference next week, the Pop Culture Association conference, on Shaver and the reaction of science fiction fandom to him, as well as Ray Palmer.
Get
In
out
the
of
40s.
town.
So I'm knee deep in that right now.
Wow. Because you did such a wonderful interview. For those who don't know, they always hear me talking about the Shaver mystery short, as well as the feature, The Man Who Invented Flying Saucers. Gabriel is one of the main interview subjects in both of those films. And his knowledge was incredible even then when I spoke to you over a year ago. But I can imagine if you're researching to write more about this, your knowledge is probably even, maybe I need to interview you again. I'm sure it's shot up even more.
Yeah, and congratulations, incidentally, on your award at the Philip K. Dick Festival just the other day.
Thank you so much. I thought you'd like that one, because I knew I didn't know you'd worked on the exegesis, but I knew that you'd spoken at various Philip K. Dick type events in the past. So I thought Gabriel would like that one.
Yeah. They brought me on. So my first book back in 2000 was on Philip K. Dick and theology, and that was well before the much of the exegesis had been published. There was a pretty slim volume that came out in the late 80s, and that was mostly what I had to work with at that point. Plus the extensive letters of his that had been published. But the exegesis itself is nearly 9,000 pages, and I now have been able to read much more of it, and it didn't change too many of my conclusions. So.
Wow, we could do a whole show about that with you. Interestingly, I just had Daniel Abella from Philip K. Dick Film Festival on, I think last week or the week before. So we talked a little bit about some of the exegesis type stuff on there, but it wasn't a whole show based on it, obviously. But I might twist your arm sometime in the next 6 months and get you back and just do an exegesis episode.
Yeah, sounds good.
but we brought you on today, obviously, to talk about your fantastic new book, The Saucerian, which is, how do you pronounce? Is it I've heard it pronounced various ways.
I pronounce it Saucerian.
Yeah,
Yeah,
that's how I do as well. And it's so fantastic. And I know it's available. I was fortunate enough, thank you so much for getting me an advanced reading copy through your publisher, but it actually is available, I think, at the end of this month. Is that right?
Yeah, it comes out April 22nd. The publisher is MIT Press. It was great to be able to get an academic press interested in this, work on the history of this subculture. So.
Well, it's so important. As I mentioned to you briefly when we were in the green room beforehand, there are two really interesting documentaries about Barker, and one is Shades of Grey, which is probably the more accessible, and then there's a stranger one called Whispers from Space, which I haven't seen Whispers from Space for probably 15 years or more, but they're both fantastic. But they can obviously, a documentary, you can only tell so much of the story in, it's just the way a documentary is. So all the minutiae and all the details about Barker, you can't cover as a documentarian in an hour and a half. So I've been somebody who's been interested in him myself for a number of decades, but I've started to read your book. And as I mentioned to you before as well, I normally speed read a book if I've got a guest coming on, because that's what you do. You've got like a day to read the book. Oh, well, I'll just knock it off in 2 hours or whatever. I couldn't speed read this, not because physically I couldn't, but it was so interesting. Like the minutiae and the details of all this stuff I didn't know about Barker. Somebody who knows a bit about him just drew me in, and I couldn't do the normal speed reading. So maybe we can start there. Talk about how did Barker first pop up on your radar? What was it that made you want to write this book?
So I worked on a book called The Flying Saucers Are Real by Jack Womack. He's a science fiction author who won the Philip K. Dick Award back in, I think, 1993.
It's a great book. I didn't know you worked on that either.
Right behind me here.
Got it here.
So yeah, Jack has a legendary book collection on all kinds of weird subjects, conspiracy stuff, the paranormal, cryptids, and he was kind of breaking off the UFO portion of his library for placement in an institutional collection. It's at Georgetown now alongside his author's archive. And my job at the time was to help inventory it and prepare it for before getting placed there. And as I'm going through it, I'm somebody who, I had a little interest in UFO books earlier in my youth. I read, the first couple Whitley Strieber books when I was a kid and gave myself some nightmares that way. But it was never something that I was super into. I got much more into science fiction, Philip K. Dick in particular. But the books that I found jumping out at me the most and really grabbing my attention were these weird big letter size soft covers with this like bold lettering on the cover and really weird titles like How to Contact Space People and things like that. And the best title in the collection, without a doubt, was They Knew Too Much About Flying Saucers. Yep, you've got it timed. So, and I didn't realize, when I was first going through this, there's a connection between these two things, right? But I noticed that imprint, Clarksburg, West Virginia, which is, that's not a major publishing hub, right? So those jumped out too. And so as I got to learn more about the books in this collection, I realized that this Gray Barker guy was publishing the weirdest and most visually kind of compelling books in the field of UFOs from the 50s through the 80s. And so I got really interested in the bibliography, just wanting to know like what was the shape of the corpus that this press was putting out, because it was really pushing some really intriguingly fun and weird narratives. And then the more I learned, I discovered those documentaries, and I learned that the life story of this publisher and author was pretty fascinating as well. And not only that, but that his extensive archive was preserved in a public institution, the Clarksburg Harrison Public Library in Clarksburg, West Virginia. So I had to make a research pilgrimage, which turned into the first of a couple. There and really, getting very deep into the depths of what is in that archive. There's a lot of correspondence, a lot of ephemera, books, like books that were published in editions of maybe 5 copies are there, things that he privately circulated, and just a wealth of material on both his life, from all angles, but also the field that he was working in and really helping to shape during that period. So it wasn't until a few days into my second trip down there, this project in my mind was always a bibliography. It was going to be about the books. And on my a few days into my second research trip, I realized there's probably enough here to make this a biography instead, which was fortunate, because that turned out to be the thing that the publisher was more interested in than my kind of bibliographical rabbit hole kind of project. They wanted the broader story, and I think that was good of them to nudge me in that direction.
Well, I think it's good for history that we have this book, because it's a book that has clearly been needed. I think a lot of those early vital figures of sorcerdom aren't written about enough, and we live in a time, as you're very aware of, which is very immediate. So when we talk about UFOs today, all anybody wants to talk about is tic-tac videos and congressional hearings, while there is this rich and important history that you can't, I don't even think, understand the modern conversation in. And most people, by the way, can't understand the modern conversation because they don't understand that it comes out of this very long history. Is that something you were conscious of when you were writing this as well, that we need to start contextualizing some of this stuff in an older history?
It was. I think the history to me is so much more interesting for a few reasons. One of them being just the characters, the personalities are just so. There are a lot of big personalities in the UFO field, and especially in the 50s and 60s. But then also just the fact that when these newer stories come out and people are circulating them, we can see like this is a story that's been around before. This is not a new thing. This is, you can see those parallels and know, where this story has come from and where it's gone before. And I think it's really important to be aware of that history.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. It's interesting when you were talking before, maybe this is something we just talk about a little bit, because I think it is fascinating, and it comes out very clearly early on in your book, is that you mentioned before how the covers and the titles of Barker's books first were what drew your attention. And that's something he'd always done, even from when he started launching newsletters. Like, you make the point in the book that while these other early flying saucer newsletters tried to present themselves as these very serious, collections of knowledge, Barker was never above having like a gaudy, image and title and trying to make it more exciting. And he seemed to understand that there was that element to these stories as well.
Yeah, he came from the world of science fiction fandom. And it's a little difficult to trace his history in fandom because he told the story different ways. So in one telling of the story, he was introduced to science fiction by a roommate who gave him a science fiction magazine when he was in college, and then he was really into the genre. In a later telling, he flips it, where he's the one introducing his roommate to science fiction, and not just any science fiction, but he's giving him I Remember Lemuria specifically in 1945. So it's tough to know, which is who's the chicken and who's the egg there. But by 1952 or so, when he's getting involved with Albert Bender and the International Flying Saucer Bureau, which I'm sure we're going to talk more about in the upcoming hour, Bender was really more active in science fiction fandom. So I think he kind of got into it a little bit through Bender and the IFSB. But there were prominent science fiction fans who were on the board of the IFSB, insofar as Bender would essentially just name anybody to the board, but well-known people in science fiction fandom. So in science fiction fanzines, there's this kind of use of the limited copying technology available to kind of inspire creativity instead of using it as a limitation. And combined with that, this kind of spirit of one-upmanship of, I'm going to make a better stencil than was on, last month's issue of Yandro or whatever. And so I think that's really what we see in the first few issues of the Saucerian, is him entering into that kind of approach to the copying technology that he had available and really using it to make a visually striking magazine. And by the sixth issue of the Saucerian, which is the last one, it is a thick, elaborate, beautiful publication where he's using clip art from movie posters and advertising materials, and that takes a lot of work. So it slowed him down. So he was never able to keep to a publishing schedule.
It's just fascinating. And we are going to talk more about the International Flying Saucer Bureau and Bender, of course. We'll get to that. But let's rewind just a little bit before we hit that. Not that far, but just a couple of years. Let's jump, I think, now into what kind of first brings him into the flying saucer field as a journalist and a publisher. And that's the Flatwoods Monster story. Can you tell us a little bit about Bender's involvement with that?
Yeah, sure. So Barker, as he told the story, and I do want to caution that any telling of any story that comes from Barker's typewriter, you do need to have a grain of salt that you take with it, and sometimes a boulder of salt. But he told the story that one day he's eating breakfast at a diner in Clarksburg, and he looks down at the newspaper and sees the byline of his hometown. He grew up in a town just north of Sutton, West Virginia. Flatwoods is to the northeast, so basically the next town over from where he grew up, about a group of people who had seen this bizarre green and red monster after what appeared to be a saucer or fireball or something crashed on the hilltop. And they climbed up and saw this giant, bad-smelling thing that basically scared them away, and they had weird medical effects after. So he's fascinated by this, and he says, I'm going to go down and find out what happened. He's not at this point a journalist or investigator of any kind, though he very quickly starts kind of presenting himself as one. And so he goes about a week after the sighting. He's not able to make it down there because he can't get away from work. And he arrives to find that the principal witnesses have mostly gone to New York for a radio interview. And so there's nobody for him to talk to. But he makes the most of it over what he calls 3 days. It's actually about a day and a half that he spends in the area. But he spins this into a pretty detailed account of his investigation. He writes up a short version of it for Fate magazine, which, of course, at that time is edited by Ray Palmer. And that appears in an issue in 1952. But he's looking for a home for the full version of his report of this weird occurrence. And he looks for a couple venues, but then kind of gives up and decides to launch his own zine instead. So in about a year after those sightings, he publishes the first issue of the Saucerian in 1953, which is not the first flying saucer zine, but it is among the first. So the earliest ones start in 1951-52. So he's in that very, very early stage of this kind of subculture.
It's interesting that he sends that. Obviously, it's interesting for me, above and beyond, that he sends that first story to Ray Palmer, or he inquires of Palmer, I think you say, and then Palmer says he'll pay him X amount of money for how many words, and he goes and he investigates the Flatwoods Monster story. And I certainly knew that it was in Fate. I have that Fate issue here, but I didn't know what the background story was. So again, it's a reason I can't turn the pages of your book too quickly, because I'm learning all of these things. And maybe I'm trying to. Maybe we can segue. Maybe we'll segue this way to the Bender story, because the Al Bender story, and that's getting us back to the IFSB story as well, and it eventually gets us to They Knew Too Much About Flying Saucers. But I've heard said, and certainly your book seems to suggest the same thing, that in many ways, early on at least, Barker was influenced by Palmer and Palmer's way of phrasing things like the Shaver mystery. And then, Barker launches the Bender mystery. So maybe now this is a way we can go from that into the Bender mystery, which is perhaps the next most important thing that Barker does as far as the popularization of, or the introduction of an early story into the UFO fold, which still is here and alive and well today.
Yeah, and I think he's absolutely appealing to Palmer's use of the word mystery in calling this the Bender mystery. So very early on in his, around the same time that he was writing that piece for Fate, Barker came across an ad in a science fiction magazine for the International Flying Saucer Bureau. And so he wrote in and was quickly appointed the West Virginia representative, and very soon after was appointed to the Department of Investigation. Bender was who's the founder of the IFSB, was very into giving people titles and jobs. And so he's doing that for a few months. They're kind of sending reports back of sightings back and forth, and sending each other very formal letters about them, critiquing them. And there starts to be some paranoia amongst the members of the IFSB. And part of that seems to be because of a guy named the Reverend S.L. Daw, who was an elderly gentleman who was another member of the investigation committee, who was visited by members of, by agents from the FBI. And he was not visited because of anything having to do with saucers. He was investigated because he was taking pictures of gun emplacements in Washington, D.C. I believe because he thought he saw a saucer behind them or something like that. But, the FBI didn't look too kindly on people taking pictures of military sites then as now. And so he writes to Barker and a couple other members of the committee saying, hey, this weird thing happened. So that's in the air, that the idea of government agents visiting members of saucer groups. And then there are some other incidents. Barker gives someone a business card. It's probably a hitchhiker that he picked up. But this fellow has a seizure and is in the hospital, and he doesn't have any identification except for Barker's business card. And so he later tells the story that the FBI visits him to see if he can identify this person. I don't think it was the FBI. I think it was the local police, because that makes much more sense. But in any event, this is another case of the authorities visiting someone. There are a couple others, but Bender is someone who's a little high strung, and he starts to get very nervous about all of this. And then in September 1953, very shortly after Barker has published the first issue of the Saucerian, something happens to Bender. And basically the only versions of it we have come to us through Barker's typewriter. So as I was saying, grain of salt with everything. But he says that he's visited by 3 men in black suits who tell him he needs to stop all saucer research and close down his group. And he basically, after this, does not want to talk to any of his former associates in the IFSB. He'll only answer their questions begrudgingly. And Barker later gives a very detailed account of all of this in his book, They Knew Too Much About Flying Saucers. And he basically declares this not too long afterwards, the Bender mystery, trying to figure out who these people were and why they wanted to silence this guy who was running a saucer research organization, and what is the secret that Bender had uncovered. And he finds other stories from elsewhere in the world, from Canada, from Australia, that aren't really the same. They're not stories of 3 men in black suits shutting down a saucer organization, but there's enough there that he can kind of spin as similar that he can call these instances of the same thing. And so only later does this end up being called Men in Black. That's a term that is coined by John Keel in the 60s. For Barker, in this period, he's calling it either, full sentence, the 3 men in black suits, or he's referring to it, if he needs a shorthand, as hush-up cases, cases of, authorities telling saucer witnesses or researchers to be quiet. But who those authorities are is never known, and that is ultimately the mystery, I think.
That's a wonderful overview of that story. How much do you think that Barker was also, because I know it's in the book, he mentions it obviously in They Knew Too Much About Flying Saucers. How much do you think the Harold Dahl and Fred Chrisman's story at Maury Island and Dahl being visited by a man in black influence that later telling of the story of the Bender case?
I think it's absolutely an influence, at the very least in the background. Barker had definitely read The Coming of the Saucers. He even reviewed it in an early issue of the Saucerian. So he was definitely aware of this. And I think, he's using that as a bit of a template to build this on. Even though it's not a story that he goes into detail on in his own book, I think he might not want to point too closely at that as source material, and so he's drawing much more on other stories.
I love seeing how these ideas that have become just ubiquitous, not just in ufology but in culture just generally. Obviously, we don't even need to mention the Will Smith vehicles, right? But the idea that these things that everybody, if you say Men in Black to somebody today, they instantly know like what that means, but that there were these people in relatively small little circles back in the day developing this mythology in what at the time was probably only read by, in fairness, They Knew Too Much About Flying Saucers was a bestseller, but still, it was still on the cultural fringes, right? But somehow that these things have now become real archetypes in the subconscious of just not just popular culture, but just generally, it's just out there.
Yeah, and one thing that's fascinating about them is that it kind of accumulates these details that then become part of a template. And so I use this terminology throughout the book of micro-narratives, narratives, meta-narratives. And so a meta-narrative is essentially when there are a bunch of individual stories and someone kind of compiles them into a story that can kind of group them together in hopes of finding an explanation for them. And one thing that I found really fascinating about the Men in Black in particular is that in one of Hilary Evans' books, he's giving, an account of the archetypal Men in Black experience. And he lists all these elements, there are 3 of them, they're in black suits, they arrive in an out-of-date car, etc. But then if you actually start to look at the individual narratives, he's got maybe 15 elements that he's identifying. And you'll find stories that have only 2 or maybe even only 1 of those elements that get used as an example of the meta-narrative. And so it's this really interesting way that these stories about these stories end up having so much weight that they pull things onto them. I think it's definitely something that happened with a lot of UFO stories. I think the Roswell narrative is a great example, where it kind of pulls on all these details from a whole range of crash saucer stories that then get kind of attached onto this one narrative as kind of the hook. And I think that's definitely something that happened with the Men in Black as well.
I mean, all of the, I want to dissect this more, but then we'll run out of time, because I want to start talking about the beginning of the Roswell type story, which you mentioned in passing in the book as well, like the Frank Scully book, where this kind of mythology first starts. But that's another show.
It is, right? Yeah,
for a whole episode. Let's stick with Barker. Let's talk about how so much of respectable ufology, like I'm thinking of Donald Kehoe, I'm thinking of NICAP, I'm thinking of people within that space, didn't want to talk about the contactee phenomenon. But for Gray Barker, that was part and parcel of the entire story. Can you talk about a bit of Barker's relationship with the UFO contactee movement?
Yeah. So yeah, you're right. The kind of more, what now we call maybe the nuts and bolts wing, really was not interested in contactees. And Barker had what became a pretty contentious relationship with a lot of the kind of more, I don't know if level-headed is the right word, but some of the more scientific approach kind of ufologists of his day. At first in the Saucerian Bulletin, which was kind of the follow-up to his initial zine, he would publish stories of contactees, but in a pretty ironic way. He's kind of making fun of them the same way that some of the people like CSI in New York, Civilian Saucer Intelligence, would make fun of them. But then at a certain point, he kind of stops with the humor and just starts presenting the stories, as they are. And then kind of eventually starts presenting them maybe a bit more as a booster of these stories. And by the end, he is, essentially a primary purveyor of contactee stories. Though he never says, this is true, this account is this is definitely spacemen. He always puts it with a question mark in his advertising materials and his introductions. But I think one of the main contactees whose story he kind of helped to develop and disseminate was Howard Menger, the New Jersey contactee who wrote From Outer Space to You, which was actually the first book published by Saucerian Books once he kind of spun his zine into a book publishing concern. And he remained interested in all manner of contactees, for the rest of his career, both what we might term physical and psychic contactees alike, though I think what you end up seeing is there's a lot of overlap between those two categories.
Oh, indeed there is. It's funny because when I operated in the academic space, I obviously was, I suppose, very, I had to be very, very skeptical, and I still am skeptical in many ways. But one thing that always has befuddled me, and this is just me making a comment, we don't have to talk about it at all, is that how eventually mainstream ufology was so happy to accept the abductee experience, because somehow it feels more scientific than the contactee experience, right? But to me, there's no no objective difference to these, these stories. Just one fits our modern sci-fi and scientific tropes than the contactee story. So it's kind of ironic that ufology was able to grab one, the nuts and bolts ufology, as you mentioned before, while the contactees were always like, oh, that's just silly. I mean, I'm not sure how one's more sensible than the other, to be honest.
Yeah, and one thing that's fascinating is that in some of Barker's writing in the 70s, you see him come the closest towards, kind of traditional skepticism in writing about things like the Travis Walton case. And it's because he's looking at it and saying, this is just like the contactees. It's not different enough for him. But yeah, it's like the field was looking for a narrative that had enough weirdness that it didn't sound like someone had just made it up. right? Which was the kind of critique of George Adamski and people like that. It was the problem wasn't that there was a claim of contact with an alien person. It was that the claim was of something that seemed too pedestrian, and that aliens would be weirder than this. And so then stories of weirder aliens then arise. And yeah, the field is definitely much more willing to accept those because they have the right level of weirdness.
Let's talk a little bit about one of and his relationship with him. One of Barker's perhaps best friends. I obviously didn't meet Barker because he passed, unfortunately, when I was still a boy. Really had, so there was no way I was going to be in the field then. But I was fortunate enough to meet Jim Moseley and spend time getting drunk with Jim Moseley at a UFO conference in Clearwater, and he was a hoot. My two greatest memories of when I was doing my PhD work was meeting John Keel at Fort Fest and hanging out with him at a bar, although Keel was diabetic then, so he would only drink like Diet Coke or something. Jim Moseley was not diabetic, or at least I don't know if he was, so he was happy to like pound them down and tell hilarious stories. But Jim Moseley was perhaps, I think he was described as the gadfly on the neck of ufology or something. He was this wonderful human being who used to publish a long-running newsletter called Saucer Smear, which I still miss getting in my mailbox to this day. But he was also very good friends with Gray Barker, and they got into all kinds of mischief and mayhem. And maybe you could just tell some stories about Moseley and Barker, because it's one of my favorite parts of the Barker mythology, I guess.
Yeah. They were absolutely best friends, closer to each other than anyone else in either of their lives, I think. And they certainly did like to play a prank. Barker had a number of kind of co-conspirators in pranks and hoaxes that he engaged in over the years. But Jim Moseley was definitely one of the chief ones. So probably the best known one is the Straith letter, where they had gotten their hands on some government stationery, specifically from the State Department, though they had some from a couple different government agencies. And they sent out a whole slew of hoax letters on this. I think they wrote about 7 in total, I think. And most of them sank without a trace. But one was sent to George Adamski, claiming to be from R.E. Straith from the State Department's Cultural Exchange Committee, letting Adamski know that members of the State Department quietly but could not publicly support what his work was and what he was saying and doing. And so Adamski publicized this, I think, more than Barker and Moseley maybe thought or hoped that he would. And it became a bit of a debacle, particularly because this may have been a crime, using this government stationery. And so there was some kind of investigation. People have looked for a record of an FBI investigation because Barker said that it was the FBI that had spoken to him. And nothing has ever been found from FOIA requests and things. I think it was actually the State Department that was investigating him, and they don't necessarily have the same record keeping requirements because it was their letterhead, right? But I'm not a FOIA master, but I did put in a couple of requests that didn't turn in anything, and other people like Nick Redfern have gotten a bit more, I think, but nothing on this. So Barker kind of backpedaled a bit. He was reluctant to publish the letter because maybe it was a little too obvious that it was typed on his typewriter, and perhaps even worse than disguising his letter writing style, he could not disguise his handwriting. So the signature on it was pretty clearly done by his pen. So it became a bit of a problem in ufology that this was circulating, but it was something that could be published on. So he did write some long editorials about it at the time, well hoping that that he would not be spending any time in prison for it. But it did eventually quiet down. But then who is the one who revives it a few years later after, it's pretty clear that there's no further threat of investigation? It's Barker himself. In Gray Barker's Book of Adamski writes a long account in the 60s of this thing that had occurred almost 10 years earlier. That was probably the best known one. They also did photographs and film, and made a lot of prank phone calls, including several dozen, if not several hundred, to John Keel, many of which end up being reported as legitimate instances of the paranormal in the Mothman prophecies. But you can see Seagray's fingerprints all over them, and even his name in a couple cases.
Well, Barker even likely hoaxed John Keel during the Mothman flap, and maybe that's where we can go next, because I suppose when most people think of the Mothman prophecies, particularly today, because of the success of the film, and also obviously the book is more freely available, and that's John Keel's The Mothman Prophecies. And again, it's such an important book. It's one of my favorite books I've ever read. And incidentally, I think my three favorite Saucer books of all time are The Mothman Prophecies by John Keel, They Knew Too Much About Flying Saucers by Gray Barker, and The Coming of the Saucers by Kenneth Arnold and Ray Palmer. They're both just, whether any of them are real or not, the literary value of just the weirdness and the strangeness when you read those books is phenomenal. But back to the Mothman Prophecies. So most people are very conscious of Keel's The Mothman Prophecies. But of course, Gray Barker published his own Mothman Prophecies book, and it came out before the Mothman Prophecies, and that book is The Silver Bridge. Maybe you could talk a little bit about Barker's The Silver Bridge.
Yeah, The Silver Bridge is absolutely my favorite book of Barker's. It is really poetic and dreamlike, and it didn't make as much of an impact because he does something that Keel absolutely doesn't want to do. And actually, Keel wrote some not quite angry, but disappointed letters to Barker over this book, because he is willing to make up stories and to tell things that didn't happen. And it's because he is attempting to create this dreamlike environment and make the whole thing a commentary on the field of ufology and the paranormal in general. And so he's really, not trying to tell a straightforward story of the Mothman. And to someone like John Keel, that's disappointing. Even though I think Keel is doing something very similar in the Mothman Prophecies itself, where he is also taking these kind of things that aren't related, except maybe through synchronicity, and pinning them on and changing the name of witnesses, and taking one story and splitting it into two and saying it happened to two different people. There's absolutely things that John Keel does. Barker is just doing it a little more openly. And my favorite passage in the book is early on. There's a chapter describing someone called the Recorder, who goes up on a mountaintop and is kind of manipulating events in the Ohio River Valley below, as this kind of godlike figure who has the power to change things. And that's a commentary on the writer of the books about these things. That person has the power to move a witness from here to there, to make a saucer appear where no saucer was, and things like that. And so he's really commenting on the role of literary creation in kind of crafting these narratives. And yeah, I think it's just a wonderful and weird book. Great prose, and definitely worth reading, both for what it says about the Ohio River Valley in 1967, and for what it says about, the world of UFO and paranormal publishing throughout history.
I think I finally was able to obtain a copy, a first printing, like the hardcover of The Silver Bridge. I think you pointed me at it. I think I wanted a copy, and you were like, well, here's a cheap copy on a reasonably priced copy on Amazon. And I was like, oh, thank you, Gabriel. And I went and I bought it, if I recall.
Yeah. I've gotten very good at scoping the used books and snatching them up. So, man, but I've got that one already. So
I need to hit you up. I need to hit you up even more, because while I've been making the documentary, the amount of Palmer stuff I've had to buy isn't even funny, as I'm sure you're conscious of as well. Trying to.
Well, yeah, Palmer ran a much. I don't think that he had the same kind of length of mailing list that Barker had. But he published a lot of monthly magazines, whereas Barker was putting out books. And yeah, that means there's a lot of Palmer material out there.
I remember I was fascinated too, and this is more of an aside. This is for me and you more than for the audience. But when you let me know that I think the Silver Bridge might have been like, it was published by Saucerian Books, but it was actually printed in Amherst, Wisconsin.
Yeah, so Barker was
By Palmer.
always looking for the cheapest way to get his stuff printed. And so for a while, he went bankrupt in the early 60s publishing hardcover books. He realized, that was what he knew because he had published his own first book as a hardcover through a traditional New York publishing house. And he thought, I can do that myself. But he didn't have the distribution network in place, and so he couldn't make it profitable. He went bankrupt after a few years of doing that, and he started running things off on office copying equipment in his office. He said, "Okay, I have a mailing list of 1,000 people. I'll print 1,000 copies, and I know I can sell those." And they don't care what it looks like. They don't care if it has a dust jacket. They just want the information that's inside. So he was always looking for the cheapest way to get things printed, but also didn't necessarily want to have to do it all himself, as he did for a few years after his bankruptcy. And Palmer owned a commercial offset printing press. He ran a business called Tomorrow River Printers in Amherst, Wisconsin. They published all kinds of stuff. I have a community cookbook like you would buy at the town bake sale that was printed by them. So Palmer gave him a good deal on printing. And so throughout the early to mid 70s, Tomorrow River was printing Saucerian's publications in Amherst. This was when Barker was publishing Saucer News. He bought it from Jim Moseley in the late 60s, and that was about the time that he made the jump to having Palmer print his stuff.
It's funny, I was in Amherst. I'm not that far from it. I'm like 40 to a minute, depending how fast you drive, to 50-minute drive from Amherst. And Brian Emmerich, who I'm not sure if you know, but he's one of the other interviewees in my film. He visited from New York this past weekend here, and Emmerich in fact, you get on really great with Emmerich. He's the primary. I shouldn't say primary. He probably owns more of the Shaver artwork than anybody on the planet, and he and he has a massive collection. And I'm going to flash this up because it's still here from the last time, because you'll dig it. He also owns more. He owns a bunch of the Shaver Palmer ephemera, like the letters between them and various other things. But we went and visited the Palmer grave site last weekend, and there's Emmerich there at Ray Palmer's grave. But I also showed him where one of the Palmer publication places was in Amherst, and we also visited Raymond B. Palmer, where the Ray Palmer's son, and he showed us it's his garage now, where what was called the chicken coop, where Palmer originally published things out of, because they had like kind of boxes, like chicken nesting boxes, where they where Palmer would have all his like mail and everything in. So we went and visited that weekend. You need to visit sometime so I can take you there, Gabriel, as well. Let's stay on Barker though, because I'll disappear to Palmer forever if I can. When I wrote my PhD dissertation, to me, one of the most important impacts on ufology was the Condon Committee, when the University of Colorado accepted an offer from the U.S. government via the U.S. Air Force, under pressure from Gerald Ford and various other people who were in the U.S. Congress at the time, to try to do an independent investigation on flying saucers when people were becoming suspicious of the way that Project Blue Book were handling things. And then the University of Colorado, i.e. the Condon Report, essentially said, you don't have to worry about anything. There's nothing here. Flying saucers aren't a thing. And there's all kinds of contentious backstory we can get into about that. But just what was the impact on people like Barker, who were operating within this space post the Condon Committee, post the University of Colorado's output on the flying saucer mystery?
So the first book that Barker put out after the Condon Committee report was Timothy Green Beckley's Book of Space Brothers. which is a compilation of channeled messages from contactees. And not too long after that, he put out How to Contact Space People by Ted Owens. And Ted Owens is his own character. There's a great biography of him called PK Man, definitely worth checking out. These are not based in scientific evidence or the scientific method. These are the works of people who are communicating their experience of the world, as strange as that may be. And what a committee in Colorado says can affect that, right? They are living this experience, and these are the books describing it. And so I think what happened for Barker was actually a spike in publications. He didn't see things dropping off. He published more in that first year after the Condon Committee than he had in almost a decade. So I think it was a period of kind of, I don't know if retrenchment is the right word, but definitely it was a place when people who were committed to stories of extraterrestrials and things in the sky were doubling down. They were saying, you know, we're going to continue to tell these stories. We're not going to let this committee tell us what to believe, even at a time when mass culture was heavily backing away after a kind of spike in interest in the late 60s.
Now, this is always something which perhaps in the past was more difficult to talk about than now, but maybe you can talk a little bit about Barker's personal life and his sexual identity and, you know, those kind of things, and how that might have been interconnected with some of his front-facing presentation as, you know, the Saucerian or the saucer guy.
Yeah. So Barker was gay, and he lived his entire life in West Virginia, then as now not the most liberal or progressive of states. And he lived I don't know to what extent he was closeted. He was certainly out to some of the closest people to him. He wrote really kind of detailed letters about his life to Jim Moseley, in which he's being pretty clear and open about his sexuality. He was even a subscriber to One magazine, which was a very early gay rights periodical published in the 1950s by an offshoot of the Mattachine Society. And he was a subscriber to it within its first year of publication. So he was definitely someone who was aware of the kind of fight for gay rights that kind of didn't explode until over a decade later. David Houchin, who for a long time was the curator of Barker's archive at the library in Clarksburg, has a theory that he mentions in the Shades of Grey documentary, that in a small town like Clarksburg, you can only be eccentric for one thing. And that it's better to be known as the flying saucer guy than as the sexual deviant. And I think there's a lot to that theory. While at the same time acknowledging that Barker really had made a place for himself in Clarksburg. He had never had any desire, at least not that he communicated to anyone, to live anywhere else. This was where he lived and where he wanted to remain. And so he kind of carved out a space for himself to live his life, the way he wanted to in the state that he was born in. And I think that's really a kind of source of inspiration, I think, in a lot of ways.
That's something which fascinates me about Barker as well, because I know Moseley in Shades of Grey says he thinks that Barker would have been happier if he'd moved to, like, I don't know, the New York or somewhere, right? But that parochialism or that rural background of Barker, how much do you think that informed who he was as well?
I think a lot. And there are places in his writing where you see him writing really movingly about the rural landscape. He wrote poetry about the West Virginia landscape. One of his early poems was called Mountain Poet. And there's a passage in Howard Menger's From Outer Space to You that does not appear in Menger's original manuscript, which survives in Barker's files, but is in the published version. So I think there's a fair bet that it was written by Barker, where he's writing really kind of poetically about farm life, because Menger lived on a farm. in the late 50s. And so I think the landscape and the kind of rural environment, even though he did live in Clarksburg, which is a small city, but very close to the mountains of West Virginia, that it was really that environment shaped him and is where he felt comfortable and wanted to remain.
We chatted a little bit, I guess, when we were talking about Men in Black about this, but what do you think is the impact of Graybark, which I think is considerable, and I'm sure you probably can add to that considerably, is what do you think his impact is on what people think about UFOs and believe about UFOs today?
So what's interesting is that as important as Barker was in various points in the field, he was somebody who was rejected by mainstream ufology pretty early. They saw him as somebody who was playing pranks and doing hoaxes, and that's not what we do. We're serious scientific investigators. And yet, they end up incorporating narratives that he has shaped into the kind of official history of UFOs. And so even though there was this kind of, desire to kind of push him out as somebody who is not reliable, the stories themselves are powerful enough that they creep back in. I think I say somewhere in the book, in ufology, the fringe has a nasty habit of always returning to the center. So Barker's direct influence is a little hard to trace, except in some of the more obvious places like the Men in Black or the Flatwoods Monster story specifically. But I think he had an aesthetic influence that's much, much broader, and really influenced everything that came after him, where the way that he told a story, the way that he would hedge on a statement so that he's making it a question instead of a statement, kind of giving you an inference that you can then meet to kind of finish telling the story in your own mind. These are rhetorical techniques that we see in writing on UFOs and the paranormal all over the place. And Barker was not only a master literary craftsman at spinning these kind of stories, but also was very self-reflective, and in things like The Silver Bridge is showing you what he's doing, and really kind of pointing out in a poetic and subtle way the kind of ways in which these things that the world of ufology really wants to look at as scientific data are actually narratives that survive as stories with, beginnings, middle, and ends. And that's the way they actually can propagate. And so I think that's a complex and convoluted answer, perhaps, but it was a complex and convoluted career that he had. So
I have two questions for you still, and they're kind of related. The first one is, what do you think Barker really thought about UFOs?
That is one where some people want there to be an easy answer. Not too long after he died, someone wrote something saying, well, clearly he was just in it for the money and didn't believe anything. But looking at some of his actual financial documents, you can see that he lost a lot more money than he ever made on UFOs. And so you can't really just count it as a profit motive. If he wanted to make money, there are a lot better ways he could have done it. So I think he really saw this as an area of culture where he could have an impact. And in the documentaries about him, people they interview his nephews, people that he knew when they were young, and they're always talking about how he would tell them campfire stories. He was always telling them scary stories and playing pranks on them. And I think he looked at the world of UFOs as one of his nephews. This is a kind of collection of children who he can entertain and, give them a good scare, and then get them scaring each other as well with their own stories. And I think he really saw it as a story that he could shape. Which isn't to say that he didn't believe that things might be real. I think it was just he was not functioning on that level. He was functioning on the level of, these are stories that I'm going to tell you.
Now, what might or might not be the toughest question of the show, what are your thoughts on UFOs? What's your take on this phenomenon, if you have one?
So so I don't have an easy, yes or no to that, because to me the question of, to phrase it another way, do you believe in UFOs, right? Yes, I believe that people see things and don't know what they are. That does not necessarily mean that I feel beholden in any way to anyone's explanation of anything that they've seen. And so my approach to the whole thing really is on the level of folklore. And yes, these stories exist, but we don't have access to the things behind the stories. And I don't know that there's even as many interesting things to learn about anything that might be behind them, as in looking at how stories grow and propagate. To me, that's much more fascinating, the things that occur on the human level. And so, I know that people are very interested in, the truth. I don't know that there is a truth that we can get at, but we can certainly learn a lot by looking at how these narratives, develop.
Yeah, that's a good answer, and I agree with you. Now, I guess this really is the final question. How do people get a copy of the Saucerian? What's the best way for them to find this?
Yeah, sure. So the book, The Saucerian, UFOs, Men in Black, and the Unbelievable Life of Gray Barker, is going to be published on April 22nd of this year from the MIT Press. And it's available from anywhere you get books, from your local bookstore is always my recommendation. But if you need to go to the internet, it's there too. And you can find me online at gabrielmckee.com. I'm also on Blue Sky, Instagram, and a couple of the other ones. Usually I don't have like a single username on all of them, but it's usually variations on Secret Terror from Gray Barker's book, MIB, The Secret Terror Among Us.
Well, Gabriel, it's always an incredible privilege to talk to you. I always walk away from a conversation with you feeling like I know so much more than before I entered that conversation. Thank you so much for visiting with me on Talking Weird today.
Yeah. Thanks for having me. This has been a great conversation.
Man, and until I talk to you again, which hopefully will be soon, and until I talk to everybody else out there, please keep it weird.
Thank you.